The servo skull drifted through the empty council chamber, its eyeless sockets scanning rows of vacant thrones. 12 seats of absolute power. 12 high lords who governed 1,000,000 worlds. And every single one of them was dead. The ornate doors of the chamber hung twisted on their hinges, melted by weapons that should never have been turned against the ruling council of the Imperium. Scorch marks painted the gilded walls in patterns of systematic execution. This wasn't the work of heretics breaching Terra's defenses. This wasn't a chaos incursion or Xeno's assassination. The security footage told a different story entirely, one that would shake the Imperium to its foundations. The woman who walked into that chamber wore the crimson armor of the Inquisition. The woman who walked out left nothing but corpses in her wake. Her name was Ephrael Stern, and understanding why she turned her guns on the most powerful humans in the galaxy requires us to understand what she had become, what she had survived, and what she had learned in the darkness between reality and nightmare. The planet Parnis was unremarkable by Imperial standards. A hive world like 10,000 others, its population toiling in industrial sprawl beneath toxic skies. But Parnis held something that drew the eye of the Inquisition, a chaos cult that had taken root deep in the underhive, spreading corruption like a cancer through the planet's veins. Sister Ephrael Stern arrived with her squad from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, their power armor gleaming white and crimson, their faith absolute. They descended into the darkness to purge the heretics, to burn out the infection before it could spread. None of them could have known what waited in those shadows. None of them understood that this mission would be the death of everything Stern believed she was. The cult wasn't just worshipping the ruinous powers. They were opening a doorway. In the depths of Parnis, surrounded by circles of burning candles and the mutilated bodies of thousands, the cultists completed their ritual. Reality screamed as it tore open. Demons poured through the wound in space, and Stern's sisters died one by one, dragged into the warp or torn apart by entities that shouldn't exist. Stern fought with faith and fury, her bolters singing hymns of destruction, but faith alone cannot hold back the immaterium when it comes flooding in. She should have died there. Every law of the universe said she should have been consumed, her soul devoured, her body twisted into something unrecognizable. Instead, something impossible happened. The warp touched her and couldn't hold her. The demons reached for her soul and found something that burned them back. When the Inquisition finally arrived to contain the demonic incursion, they found Stern standing alone in a circle of ash, the only survivor, surrounded by the remains of entities that had been unmade. Her armor was scorched. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the psychic aura radiating from her registered on every sensor as something that had no place in baseline humanity. The Inquisition took her. Of course they took her. A human who survived prolonged exposure to the warp, who somehow fought demons with her bare hands and won, was either a miracle or an abomination. The interrogations lasted months. They tested her faith, her sanity, her very soul. They brought in the most powerful psychers to examine her, sent tech priests to scan every molecule of her being. The results were always the same: inconclusive, impossible, contradictory. Stern was human, but she was also something else. She was faithful, but she channeled power that no sister of battle should touch. She was pure, but she had been fundamentally changed by forces that corrupt everything they touch. Some in the Inquisition called her a saint, a living weapon blessed by the Emperor himself. Others called her corrupted, a sleeper agent of chaos wearing the skin of loyalty. The debates raged for years while Stern remained in custody, neither fully condemned nor fully trusted. And in that limbo, she began to see things that others couldn't. The warp had changed her vision in ways that went beyond the physical. She could perceive the threads of psychic energy that connected all things, see the currents of power that flowed through the Imperium, recognize the touch of chaos even when it wore the mask of righteousness. What she saw in those who held power over her was disturbing. The Inquisitors who interrogated her, so certain of their own purity, carried shadows in their souls: ambition, pride, the quiet corruption that comes not from chaos worship, but from wielding absolute authority without accountability. She saw how fear of her power made them irrational, how their need to categorize and control her overrode their judgment. And when she was finally deemed useful enough to deploy, assigned to hunt the enemies of mankind under the watchful eye of handlers who never fully trusted her, she began to see the rot that had taken hold in the highest levels of the Imperium itself. Her missions took her across the galaxy. She hunted traitors and heretics, purged corruption wherever she found it. But the deeper she went, the more she uncovered a pattern that horrified her. The corruption wasn't just in the obvious places, in the chaos cults and the traitor legions. It was woven into the fabric of Imperial governance itself. Lords who made pacts with dark powers while proclaiming their loyalty. Inquisitors who used chaos artifacts in the name of fighting chaos. High-ranking officials who sacrificed entire worlds, not for the Emperor's glory, but for their own advancement. The Imperium, she realized, was devouring itself from within, and those at the very top were either blind to it or complicit in it. The final revelation came during a mission to investigate suspected heresy among the administratum on Terra itself. Following the threads of corruption led her higher and higher, past governors and cardinals and generals, until she stood before evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Several of the High Lords themselves, those who sat at the peak of Imperial power, had been compromised. Not by obvious chaos worship, their corruption was more insidious than that. They had made bargains with entities in the warp, traded away humanity's future for personal power, allowed catastrophic failures to continue because fixing them would threaten their positions. They had become the very thing they claimed to fight against, and they did it all while wrapped in the symbols of Imperial authority. Stern brought her evidence to her superiors in the Inquisition. She presented documentation, testimony, psychic imprints that couldn't be falsified. She expected action. Investigation at minimum. Instead, she found silence, then denial, then threats. The Inquisition, she learned, already knew. Some had known for decades. But moving against the High Lords was unthinkable. It would shatter the Imperium's stability, cause civil war, destroy the very structure that held humanity together against the darkness. Better to let the corruption continue, to manage it, to contain it, than to risk everything in pursuit of justice. Better to sacrifice countless lives on the altar of stability than admit that the throne itself was rotten. That was when Ephrael Stern made her choice. She had seen what happened when good people did nothing, when fear of consequences became more important than truth, when the preservation of power mattered more than the lives power was meant to protect. She had been to hell and back, had stared into the warp and come out changed, had been given the power to fight monsters, and she had finally recognized the greatest monsters of all. So she walked into that council chamber, past guards who couldn't perceive her approach through her psychic shroud, past defenses that had never been designed to stop someone who could bend reality itself. She stood before the 12 High Lords, and she told them exactly what they were. Then she raised her weapons. And she did what the Inquisition itself no longer had the courage to do. The Servo Skull's footage ends there, its recording systems disrupted by the psychic shockwave of what followed. By the time reinforcements arrived, Stern was gone, vanished into the depths of Terra, or perhaps beyond. The High Lords were dead. And the Imperium faced a question it had no answer for. What do you do when your saint becomes your assassin? The Imperium's response was immediate and absolute. Within hours of the discovery, Terra went into lockdown. Custodian guards sealed every access point to the Imperial Palace. The Inquisition mobilized kill teams across 100 sectors. The Officio Assassinorum activated every asset within striking distance of the throne world. And the official proclamation went out across the Vox networks, transmitted to every corner of human space. Ephrael Stern was declared excommunicate traitoress. Her name was to be struck from all records, her deeds erased. Anyone who aided her would share her fate. The woman who had once been called saint was now the Imperium's most wanted heretic. But proclamations couldn't change what had happened. The High Lords were dead, and the power vacuum left behind began pulling the Imperium's governance into chaos. Emergency successors were appointed within days, elevated from the ranks of Lord Commanders and Master Administrators who had spent lifetimes positioning themselves for exactly this opportunity. They took their seats in that blood-stained chamber, now hastily cleansed and reconsecrated, and they spoke of unity and strength and the unchanging glory of the Imperium. They didn't speak about why their predecessors had died. The official story called it a chaos attack, a demonic assassination that had somehow breached Terra's defenses. The truth was buried under layers of classification and sealed behind inquisitorial locks that would never be opened. But truth has a way of spreading regardless of how deeply it's buried. Whispers began circulating through the upper echelons of Imperial authority. Questions that couldn't be asked openly in official channels found their way into private conversations. Why had Sister Stern turned? What had she discovered? The Inquisition's official answer was simple. She had been corrupted by her exposure to the warp years ago, a sleeper agent finally activated by the dark powers. But those who had worked with her, who had witnessed her unwavering faith and seen her destroy chaos corruption wherever she found it, struggled to accept that explanation. Doubt is a dangerous thing in an empire built on absolute certainty. Meanwhile, Stern had gone to ground in the only place where even the Inquisition's reach became uncertain. The underhive of Terra itself was a twisted labyrinth that descended miles beneath the gleaming spires of the Imperial Palace, a nightmare realm of forgotten passages and abandoned districts where billions lived and died without ever seeing the sun. Down in those depths, where even the Adeptus Arbites rarely ventured, Stern found sanctuary among the very people the Imperium had abandoned. The outcasts, the forgotten, those who fell through the cracks of a civilization that measured lives in industrial output and military conscription quotas. She didn't hide her identity from them. She couldn't, not with the psychic aura that surrounded her like visible heat, not with armor that still bore the iconography of her order despite being scorched and battle-damaged. When she walked into that underhive settlement, a cluster of makeshift structures built from industrial waste and hope, they knew what she was. Sister of Battle, Inquisition operative, someone who represented the authority that had ground them into the dirt for generations. They should have turned her in for the reward. Instead, an old woman named Kessa, her body bent from decades of labor in the manufactorums, looked into Stern's eyes and saw something unexpected. Exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but the soul-deep weariness that comes from carrying impossible choices. Kessa offered her water, then shelter. And as Stern sat in that ramshackle dwelling, surrounded by people who had nothing, the old woman asked the question that cut through all the complexity. Why did you do it? Stern's answer came slowly, each word measured and heavy. Because someone had to. Because the corruption had gone so deep that the systems meant to stop it had become complicit in it. Because she had seen the Imperium sacrifice entire worlds, billions of lives, to maintain the power of individuals who had long since stopped serving humanity's interest. Because faith without justice is just another form of tyranny. The people of the Underhive understood that in ways the nobility never could. They lived with the consequences of decisions made in distant throne rooms, decisions that treated them as numbers on production reports rather than human beings. When Stern spoke of corruption in the highest reaches of power, they nodded with bitter recognition. They had always known the system was broken. They just never imagined anyone with power would care enough to do something about it. Word spread through the Underhive network, not about Stern's location, but about what she represented. A crack in the facade, proof that even the mighty could be held accountable. And slowly, carefully, others began to find their way to her. A tech priest who had discovered evidence of embezzlement that redirected resources meant for hive maintenance into private accounts. A former Imperial Guard officer who had been dishonorably discharged for refusing an order that would have cost his entire regiment for no strategic gain. An administrative clerk who had spent years documenting the systematic falsification of tithe records. People who had seen the rot, who had tried to work within the system to fix it, and who had been crushed for their efforts. Stern listened to each of them, and as she did, a picture emerged that was even worse than what she had uncovered in her investigation. The corruption of the High Lords hadn't been an isolated incident. It was systemic, woven through every level of Imperial governance. Not because everyone was evil, but because the structure itself incentivized loyalty to power over loyalty to truth. Speak against your superiors and be branded a heretic. Question orders and be executed for cowardice. Report corruption and become the next target. The system had evolved to protect itself rather than the people it was meant to serve, and anyone who threatened that stability was eliminated, regardless of whether they were right or wrong. Above ground, the Inquisition's hunt continued with religious fervor. Lord Inquisitor Covenant, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary even among his peers, took personal command of the search. He had been one of Stern's interrogators years ago, one of those who had advocated for her execution when she first manifested her abilities. Her survival had been a mark against his judgment, and her actions now felt like a personal betrayal. He mobilized resources on a scale usually reserved for major chaos incursions. Entire districts were locked down and searched building by building. Psychic choirs scoured the Imperium for any trace of her presence. Informant networks that had taken centuries to build were activated simultaneously. But Covenant made a critical error. He assumed Stern was acting alone, that this was the work of a single corrupted individual who could be hunted and eliminated like any other target. He didn't understand that she had become something more dangerous than an individual threat. She had become a symbol. And symbols can't be killed with bolter rounds. In a chapel deep in the mid-hive, a preacher began including subtle references to justice and accountability in his sermons. In a manufactorum, workers started questioning why their quotas kept increasing while their rations decreased, started asking where the products of their labor actually went. In an Arbeits precinct, a judge started investigating cases that had been marked closed by higher authority, started finding patterns of wealth and influence that protected certain individuals from consequences. None of these people had any connection to Stern. Most had never heard her name. But the idea she represented was spreading like fire through dry timber. What if the system itself was wrong? What if loyalty to the Imperium meant standing against those who had corrupted it? The Inquisition tried to contain it the only way they knew how, with violence. Suspected sympathizers were arrested and interrogated. The preacher was executed for heresy. The judge disappeared into a black site. The manufactorum workers who had organized the questions were replaced with servitors, their personalities wiped and their bodies repurposed into mindless machines. But every crackdown created more questions. Every disappeared person became a martyr to people who were learning to see the difference between the Imperium's ideals and its reality. Stern watched all of this unfold through the information network that had grown around her. She hadn't asked to become a revolutionary. She had simply wanted justice for crimes that couldn't be ignored. But her actions had torn away a veil that could never be replaced, and now people across Terra were seeing clearly for the first time. She sat in the underhive darkness, cleaning her weapons with practiced precision, and wrestled with the weight of what she had set in motion. Had she saved the Imperium by removing corrupt leaders? Or had she wounded it so deeply that it might never recover? The enemy was at the gates, as it always was. Chaos pressed against reality. Xeno's empires encroached on human space. The Great Rift had torn the galaxy in half. Humanity needed unity to survive. And she had shattered it. Kessa found her during one of these dark meditations. The old woman sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body had long since given up on comfort, and she spoke with the blunt wisdom of someone who had nothing left to lose. You're wondering if you made a mistake, if you should have stayed silent. Let the corruption continue. Stern nodded slowly. Kessa laughed, a dry sound like wind through ruins. That's how they control you, by making you believe that justice is too dangerous. That truth will destroy us. But we've been dying for centuries under their version of order. At least now we have a choice. At least now we can see the chains. And in that moment, Stern understood something fundamental. The Imperium's greatest weakness wasn't the enemies without. It was the lie at its core, the belief that humanity could only survive through absolute control, that any deviation from total obedience was a path to extinction. That lie had created the very corruption she had fought against. It had made monsters of men who started with good intentions. It had transformed the Emperor's vision of unified humanity into a machine that consumed its own people. And until that fundamental lie was confronted, nothing would truly change. The sound of boots in the corridor outside shattered the moment. Stern was on her feet instantly, weapons ready, every sense extended. But it wasn't an Inquisition kill team. It was one of the Underhive runners, a young woman named Sella who served as a messenger in the network. Her face was pale with fear and excitement mixed together. "They're coming," she gasped. Not the Inquisition, something else, something worse. The message she carried spoke of ships arriving in Terra's orbit, vessels bearing the colors of the Adeptus Sororitas. The Order's militant were mobilizing, and they were coming for their wayward sister. The Sisters of Battle had always been Stern's family in ways that transcended blood. They were bound by faith and fire, by shared suffering and shared glory. She had fought beside them, bled with them, mourned sisters lost to the Emperor's enemies. Now they were coming to kill her, and that truth cut deeper than any blade. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become a heretic by refusing to let heresy go unpunished when it wore the robes of authority. She had betrayed the Imperium by trying to save it from itself. And now her own order would be the instrument of her execution, because that's what loyalty demanded in an empire that couldn't distinguish between obedience and righteousness. Sella stood in the doorway, waiting for orders, for a plan, for anything that would tell her what to do next. But Stern simply stood motionless, her weapons hanging loose at her sides, staring at nothing while she processed what this meant. The Inquisition she could fight. They were corrupt enough, compromised enough, that facing them carried no moral weight beyond survival. But the Sororitas were different. They were true believers, women who had dedicated their lives to faith and purity, who genuinely thought they were doing the Emperor's work. They hadn't made deals with dark powers or sacrificed worlds for personal gain. They were simply following orders given by those they trusted to speak with righteous authority. They were doing exactly what Stern herself would have done mere months ago. Kessa's weathered hand settled on Stern's armored shoulder. "You can't fight them. Not because you'd lose, but because winning would break you." The old woman understood even without knowing the details, understood that some battles cost more in victory than defeat. Stern nodded slowly, then finally looked at Sella. "How long?" The messenger's answer was measured in hours, not days. The Sororitas were already deploying drop pods to the upper hive levels, working their way down in systematic search patterns. They would reach the underhive within a cycle. And when they did, they wouldn't show mercy to anyone harboring their target. The people who had sheltered Stern began preparing to evacuate. They moved with the practiced efficiency of those who had fled authority before, gathering what little they owned into packs that could be carried quickly. Children were hushed. The elderly helped along, entire makeshift communities dissolving into the darkness of deeper tunnels. Stern watched them go and felt the weight of consequences. These people had nothing. They had already lost everything to the Imperium's grinding machinery of exploitation and indifference. And now they would lose even the small sanctuary they had carved out, all because they had shown kindness to someone the system deemed an enemy. But not everyone was leaving. As the civilians filtered away into the labyrinth, others began arriving. The tech priest who had documented embezzlement, the discharged guard officer, the clerk who had falsified nothing but had recorded everything. More came behind them, people Stern had never met, drawn by whispered messages through the Underhive network. A former Arbeits investigator who had been forcibly retired for asking uncomfortable questions. A medicae who had seen too many workplace accidents that weren't accidents at all. a scribe who had kept copies of orders that were meant to be destroyed. They came armed with whatever they could find, stubbers and improvised explosives and blades that had seen better days. They came because they had also reached a point where silence had become impossible. One of them, a scarred woman named Helena, who had once served in a penal legion, spoke for the group. "We're not fighters. Not like you, but we're done running. Done pretending the system will fix itself. If you're making a stand, we stand with you." Stern looked at these broken people, these discards of Imperial efficiency, and saw something the authorities would never understand: courage. Not the courage to die for the Emperor, that was easy when you had faith, but the courage to stand against the Emperor's servants when you believed they had lost their way. That was infinitely harder. That required a different kind of faith entirely. She wanted to tell them to run, wanted to order them away to safety, such as it was. But the words wouldn't come because she recognized the look in their eyes. She had seen it in her own reflection ever since Parnis, that hollow certainty that comes when you've crossed a line you can never step back from. These people had already made their choice. Sending them away would be taking that choice from them, and choice was the only power they had left. So instead she nodded once and began planning not for survival but for meaning. If this was to be her final stand, it would at least be for something true. The Sororitas reached the upper underhive by Terra's artificial nightfall. Stern felt them coming before any physical sign, their presence in the warp like stars of burning faith descending into darkness. She had fought beside that faith. She knew its strength and its terrible purity. The sisters believed absolutely in their righteousness, believed that serving the Imperium was serving the Emperor, that following orders from those in authority was the highest form of devotion. They would show no doubt, no hesitation, no mercy. And that made them more dangerous than any chaos cultist, because their conviction was real. The corridors of the underhive had been prepared as well as time allowed. Makeshift barricades constructed from industrial debris, improvised traps that would slow but not stop power-armored warriors, positions chosen for maximum defensive advantage with minimal collateral damage to the civilians huddling in the depths beyond. Stern's ragtag force of outcasts and truth-tellers took their positions with the kind of grim determination that comes when you've already accepted the ending. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to make their deaths count for something. The first contact came at a junction where 3 major passages converged. The Sororitas advanced in perfect formation, bolters raised, armor gleaming even in the dim emergency lighting. They chanted litanies as they moved, their voices harmonizing in prayers Stern knew by heart. She stood in the center of the junction, alone and fully visible, her weapons holstered. She didn't come to fight them. She came to speak. The sisters halted at the sight of her, their squad leader raising a fist. "Ephrael Stern, you stand accused of the highest heresy. Surrender now and face the Emperor's judgment." The voice was amplified by armor systems, but Stern recognized it anyway. Sister Sylvana, who had trained beside her years ago, who had been her shield sister in a dozen battles. Stern kept her hands visible and empty. "I stand guilty of killing traitors who wore the mask of authority. I stand guilty of demanding justice when the system had abandoned it. But I do not stand guilty of heresy. I act in the Emperor's name, not against it." The words hung in the stale air like smoke. Behind Sylvana, other sisters shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how heretics spoke. This wasn't the raving corruption they had been told to expect. This was measured, faithful, wrong in all the ways that made it impossible to dismiss. Sylvana's response came firm and unyielding. "You murdered the High Lords of Terra. You shattered the Imperium's governance. You spread discord and doubt among the faithful. These are not the actions of righteousness." Stern met her old comrade's gaze through the helmet lenses. The High Lords were corrupt. They had made pacts with the very powers we swore to fight. "I have evidence, testimony, documentation. If you serve justice rather than authority, you'll examine it before executing me. But we both know you won't, because the system no longer cares about truth. It only cares about control. The accusation struck harder than any weapon. Stern saw it in the minute shift of Sylvana's posture, the slight hesitation before she responded. We do not question those the Emperor has placed above us. That is the path to anarchy, to heresy. And there it was, laid bare. The fundamental choice that defined everything. Obey without question, or think for yourself and risk being wrong. Follow orders from those in power, or follow conscience and accept the consequences. The Imperium had built itself on the former because the latter was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too human. Stern's voice dropped, becoming almost gentle. I know you believe that. I believed it too. But faith without wisdom is just another form of blindness. The Emperor created us to be more than weapons, more than slaves to authority. He wanted us to think, to judge, to be capable of righteousness, even when righteousness is hard. You know something is wrong with what happened. I can see it in how you stand, how you hesitate. That doubt is not weakness. It's humanity. And humanity is what we're supposed to be protecting. For a moment, just a heartbeat, Sylvana's bolter lowered a fraction. Then the Vox crackled with an incoming transmission from orbit, a voice carrying the absolute authority of the canoness herself. Sylvana, your orders are clear. Execute the traitor. Do not engage in conversation. This is a test of your faith. The bolter rose again, steady and unwavering. Sylvana's voice carried the hollow finality of someone who had been broken and reshaped by doctrine. In the Emperor's name, let none survive. The squad advanced. Stern's hand moved to her weapons, not in aggression, but in profound sadness. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that some of them might listen, that the crack she had made in the facade might spread even to those most devoted to preserving it. But hope was a luxury the Imperium had long since abandoned. She keyed her Vox to the defenders hidden in the passages. Hold your fire until they're committed. Make every shot count. Not for victory, for witness. Let them know we didn't die quietly. The corridor erupted in violence. Improvised explosives detonated, filling the air with shrapnel that pinned harmlessly off ceramite armor but obscured vision. Stubber fire cracked from hidden positions, carefully aimed shots that forced the sisters to take cover, even though the rounds couldn't penetrate their protection. It was theater more than warfare, a show of defiance from people who knew they couldn't win, but refused to submit. The sisters advanced methodically, their bolters returning fire with devastating precision. Each shot was a prayer. Each kill was righteousness enforced. Stern moved through the chaos like a ghost, her enhanced abilities allowing her to predict trajectories and positions before they happened. She wasn't trying to kill her former sisters. She was trying to slow them, to force them to see her defenders as people rather than targets. She pulled a wounded clerk from the path of a bolter round, shielded a tech priest whose improvised explosives had failed, appeared in unexpected positions to draw fire away from those who couldn't dodge. And through it all, she spoke, her words cutting through the battle's roar with psychic resonance. Look at who you're killing. They're not demons. Not traitors. They're people who demanded accountability. Is this the Emperor's justice? Some of the sisters faltered. Stern saw it in hesitations that lasted only microseconds, but spoke volumes. They had been told they were fighting corruption. Instead, they were killing desperate people armed with civilian weapons, people who fought not with chaos, but with improvised defenses and bitter courage. The cognitive dissonance was a wound in their certainty. But certainty was all they had, and without it, they were nothing. So they pushed forward because stopping meant questioning everything, and questioning was the path to heresy. The fighting pushed deeper into the underhive, past the prepared positions into the residential areas where civilians still huddled in their dwellings. Stern made a decision that would haunt her forever, assuming she survived to be haunted. She stopped running, stopped fighting. She stood in the center of a wide chamber, disarmed herself, and broadcast on all frequencies. Enough, I surrender. No one else needs to die for my choices. The battle stuttered to a halt. Her ragtag defenders looked at her with betrayal and understanding mixed together. The sisters advanced cautiously, weapons trained, waiting for the trap. But there was no trap. Just a woman on her knees, hands behind her head, allowing herself to be taken. Sylvana approached slowly, her bolter never wavering. Why? After everything, why surrender now? Stern's answer was simple and devastating. Because I'm not trying to start a war. I'm trying to make you see that something is broken. And maybe seeing me executed will make some of you ask why. Maybe someone will investigate what I discovered. Maybe the cracks will spread even if I'm gone. Or maybe I'm wrong about all of this, and my death will mean nothing. But I'd rather die with hope than kill more people who are only doing what they think is right. The bindings cut into her wrists as they secured her. The sisters formed up around her in a custody formation, and the march back toward the surface began. Behind them, Stern's defenders watched in shocked silence. Some wept, others raged. All of them understood that they had just witnessed something their children would whisper about in the darkness, a legend being born from defeat. As they ascended through the hive levels, Stern noticed something that sent ice through her veins. Sylvana's hand was shaking where it gripped the bolter. And when their eyes met, the sister looked away. The ascent through the hive levels felt like a journey through the layers of the Imperium itself. The deeper darkness of the underhive gave way to the grinding industry of the manufactorums, then to the administrative sectors where bureaucrats shuffled data slates and never looked up from their work, and finally to the gleaming spires where the privileged lived in willful ignorance of everything below. Stern walked in chains, surrounded by her former sisters, and watched the reactions of those who witnessed the procession. In the lower levels, people stared with something like hope, their eyes following her until she passed from sight. In the middle levels, they looked away quickly, afraid that even witnessing might mark them as sympathizers. In the upper levels, they smiled with satisfaction, seeing confirmation that the system still worked, that heretics were still caught and punished, that order still reigned. The Sororitas command had established a temporary fortress in one of Terra's ancient cathedrals, a soaring edifice of stone and stained glass that had stood for 10,000 years. Stern was brought through corridors lined with battle sisters, each one standing at attention, their faces hidden behind helmets, but their judgment palpable in the air. She was taken to a holding cell that had once been a meditation chamber, its walls covered in devotional inscriptions and images of saints. The irony of being imprisoned among representations of holy sacrifice was not lost on her. She sat on the stone bench and waited, knowing that her trial, if it could be called that, would be brief and predetermined. But hours passed and no one came. The only sound was the distant echo of hymns from the cathedral proper, the sisters singing their evening prayers. Stern closed her eyes and listened, remembering when those same prayers had given her comfort and purpose. Now they sounded like chains made of faith, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She wondered if any of the sisters singing felt the doubt she had seen in Sylvana's eyes. She wondered if doubt was spreading like a virus through their ranks, or if it would be crushed before it could take root. The Imperium had millennia of experience in crushing doubt. The door opened without warning. Stern expected inquisitors, perhaps the canoness herself, someone with authority to pronounce sentence. Instead, Sylvana entered alone, her helmet removed, her face showing the stress of internal conflict. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply looking at Stern as if seeing her for the first time. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me it was worth it. Tell me that killing the High Lords accomplished something other than chaos and bloodshed. Give me something to believe other than that you were corrupted and I'm too weak to see it." Stern rose slowly, her chains rattling in the silence. "I can't tell you it was worth it because I don't know yet. The corruption I exposed was real. The evidence I gathered was true. But whether removing them makes the Imperium better, or just creates room for new corruption, that depends on what people do next. On whether anyone has the courage to demand change, rather than just accepting new masters who might be exactly the same." She paused, then added with devastating honesty, "I might have made everything worse. I might be wrong about all of this. But I couldn't stay silent, and I couldn't work within a system that punishes truth more harshly than lies. Sylvana moved closer, her hand unconsciously going to the bolter at her hip before dropping away. The cannon is once you executed immediately. Public ceremony, full broadcast across the sector. A demonstration that heresy is always punished regardless of who commits it. But Lord Inquisitor Covenant wants you brought to his facility for interrogation first. He thinks you had accomplices, that this is part of a larger conspiracy. They're arguing about jurisdiction right now, about who has the right to kill you. And all I can think about is that something is fundamentally wrong with that sentence. The admission hung between them like a live grenade. Stern saw the terror in Sylvana's eyes, the fear that comes from a lifetime of certainty crumbling beneath the weight of observation. This was the moment she had been trying to create, not through violence but through forcing good people to confront uncomfortable truths. But looking at Sylvana's anguish, she felt no satisfaction, only sadness for what faith without flexibility did to human minds. "You were always the better fighter," Stern said quietly. "Faster, stronger, more tactically minded. But you were also the most devout, the one who never questioned, who found comfort in absolute obedience. I envied that. It made everything simpler. I wish I could have kept that simplicity." Before Sylvana could respond, alarms began shrieking throughout the cathedral complex. The sound was primal and urgent, the kind of alert reserved for the worst-case scenarios. Both warriors tensed, old training overriding everything else. Sylvana's Vox crackled to life with panicked reports. Multiple contacts, high-orbit insertion, unidentified vessels breaching Terra's defense perimeter, all units to battle stations. The words that followed turned Stern's blood to ice. Corrupted signatures detected, chaos forces inbound. This is not a drill. The two women stared at each other with dawning horror. Terra, the throne world itself, was under attack. And the timing was no coincidence. With the High Lords dead, with the Inquisition and the Cerritos focused on hunting Stern, with the governance of humanity in disarray, someone had seen an opportunity. The defenses would hold, they had to hold, but the chaos in command structures would make coordination difficult. Stern could see the calculation running behind Sylvana's eyes, the desperate choice between duty to execute a prisoner and duty to defend humanity's heart. The choice was made for her when an explosion rocked the cathedral, sending ancient stone dust raining from the ceiling. Secondary reports flooded the Vox. Drop pods landing across the palace district, Traitor Astartes confirmed. World Eater's warband designation, civilian casualties mounting. All available forces converge on the Imperial palace approaches. Sylvana made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She drew her bolter, and for a moment, Stern thought this was the end. A quick execution before the battle. Instead, Sylvana fired at the chains binding Stern's wrists, severing them with precise shots that didn't even scratch the skin beneath. "I'm going to regret this, probably be executed for it. But I need every fighter I can get, and you're the best I know. We defend Terra first. If we survive, we sort out the rest after." She pulled a spare bolt pistol from her hip and tossed it to Stern, followed by a combat knife. "Consider yourself temporarily released into my custody. Try to run, and I'll shoot you myself. Try to help the enemy, and I'll die making sure you don't. But if you fight beside me like you used to, maybe some good comes from this nightmare." Stern caught the weapons with hands that remembered their weight like greeting old friends. She met Sylvana's eyes and saw a reflection of her own inner conflict staring back. "Thank you for trusting what you see over what you're told to believe." The moment of understanding between them was brief but profound, a recognition that they were both trapped in systems larger than themselves, trying to do right in circumstances where rightness had become impossible to define clearly. They moved through the cathedral at combat speed, joining other sisters streaming toward defensive positions. The Vox channels were alive with battle reports, each one worse than the last. The Chaos Forces had chosen their insertion points with brutal precision, targeting the governmental districts where confusion was already highest. The newly appointed High Lords were scrambling to coordinate defenses, while also trying to maintain the appearance of control. The result was contradictory orders, delays in deployment, and gaps in the defensive lines that the World Eaters were exploiting with savage efficiency. Stern and Sylvana reached the cathedral's main entrance just as the first wave of traitor Marines crashed through the outer defenses. They were nightmares made flesh, their armor twisted by the warp into something that hurt to look at directly, their weapons screaming with demonic hunger. They had once been humanity's defenders, the Emperor's finest, before they fell to Khorne's rage. Now they were everything Stern fought against. Purity corrupted into madness, strength turned into cruelty, purpose degraded into endless violence for its own sake. This was what happened when you abandoned all restraint, all judgment, all humanity in pursuit of a single absolute. They were a mirror of what the Imperium could become if it lost the last threads of conscience that still remained. The Suaritas formed a firing line, their bolters roaring in perfect synchronization. The World Eaters charged through the fire, some falling but most pushing forward with the kind of momentum that came from feeling no fear and barely registering pain. Stern found herself fighting beside sisters she had trained with, protecting women who hours ago had been prepared to execute her. The absurdity was not lost on her, but combat had a way of simplifying moral complexity into immediate necessities. Enemy there, sister here, protect the latter from the former. She moved through the chaos with the enhanced speed and perception that had marked her as different, as dangerous, as possibly corrupted. Now those same abilities kept her sisters alive, warning them of attacks they couldn't see, positioning her where the line was weakest. A massive World Eater, his armor decorated with skulls and his chain axe singing with warp fire, broke through the line and charged directly at Sylvana. She fired, but the bolt seemed to slide off his armor, as if reality itself was protecting him. Stern intercepted, her borrowed blade meeting the chain axe in a shower of sparks. The traitor's helm turned toward her, and she felt his recognition through the warp, felt him sense what she was. Sister, his voice was a grinding roar through damaged Vox systems. You bear the touch of the Imperium. Why do you fight for these corpse worshippers? Join us. Embrace the freedom of rage. Your gifts are wasted in service to a dead god. The words were meant to tempt, but they only clarified everything for Stern. This was the alternative, the path of abandoning all restraint in the name of power. She had been touched by the warp, changed by it, but she had not let it define her. She had kept her humanity, her judgment, her ability to choose right over easy. That was the difference between her and this thing that had once been human. I fight for people who are worth defending, she answered, driving her knife into the gap between his helmet and gorget. Even when they don't know, they need defending. Even when they hate me for it. That's what humanity means. The World Eater fell, his body dissolving into warp stuff that left scorch marks on the cathedral floor. But more were coming, always more, and behind them Stern could sense something worse. Greater demons materializing where reality had been weakened by violence and death. This wasn't just a raid, it was an incursion, an attempt to establish a permanent foothold on Terra itself. And it was succeeding because the Imperium's defenders were scattered, leaderless, paralyzed by the very centralized command structure that usually gave them strength. Stern grabbed Sylvana's arm, pulling her behind cover as a gout of warp fire washed over their former position. We need to coordinate the defense. The command structure is breaking down. Too many conflicting orders. Too much confusion about who's in charge. Sylvana's response was bitter. That's not our place. We follow orders, we don't give them. Stern wanted to scream at the circular logic that was getting people killed, but she forced herself to stay calm. Then we find someone who will give the right orders and make sure they have the information to do it. Or we watch Terra burn while we wait for permission to save it. The choice crystallized in Sylvana's expression, that same terrible moment of decision Stern had faced in the High Lord's chamber. Follow protocol and accept the consequences, or act on conscience and deal with the punishment later. Sylvana's Vox clicked active on a command channel she probably shouldn't have access to. All units, converge on my position. Cathedral of the Sacred Martyr. We're establishing a rally point for coordinated defense. Any senior officer hearing this, we need tactical command immediately." She looked at Stern with eyes that held fear and determination in equal measure. "Emperor, forgive me." Forces began converging from across the district. Not just Serratus, but Arbites, PDF troopers, even armed civilians who had grabbed whatever weapons they could find. They came because someone, anyone, had given clear direction in the midst of chaos. And as they formed defensive positions around the cathedral, as they began to hold ground that had been slipping away, Stern realized something that changed everything. This was what the Imperium could be if it trusted its people to think, to act, to make decisions based on immediate reality rather than distant authority. This desperate cooperation between forces that normally observed strict hierarchies was accomplishing more than the official command structure had managed in the last hour. A figure strode through the defensive line with the kind of authority that made even Chaos Marines pause. Lord Inquisitor Covenant had arrived, his armor scorched from battle, his face a mask of controlled fury. He looked at Stern standing free and armed beside Sylvana, and for a moment his hand went to his bolt pistol. Then a demon materialized behind him, and training overrode outrage. The three of them, heretic and hunter and conflicted sister, fought back to back against a foe that cared nothing for their internal disputes. And in that moment of forced cooperation, Covenant felt something shift in his absolute certainty about who the real enemy was. The demon was beautiful in the way that poison is beautiful, its form shifting between states of matter and nightmare, its voice speaking promises that bypassed the ears and went straight to the soul's deepest hungers. Covenant felt its pull, the offer of power and certainty beyond anything the Imperium could provide. Stern felt it offer vindication, proof that she was right about everything, justification for any action no matter how extreme. Sylvana felt it whisper that obedience was weakness, that she could be so much more if she just let go of all those restrictive vows. The three of them stood in a triangle around the creature, and each of them saw reflected in its ever-changing face the thing they most wanted to become. Covenant fired first, not at the demon but through it, his bolt round passing through its immaterial form to strike a world eater behind it. The demon laughed, a sound like crystal shattering in reverse. "You cannot kill what you cannot touch, Inquisitor, and you cannot touch what you do not understand. But oh, I understand you. I know what drives you, the need to be right, to prove your judgment flawless. That woman you hunt proved you wrong, and that wound to your pride cuts deeper than any blade." The words hit harder than physical attacks because they were true. Covenant had built his entire identity on being the one who saw threats others missed, who made the hard calls others couldn't. Stern's emergence as something that defied his categories, his survival when he'd called for her execution, her actions that might be righteous despite being heretical, all of it undermined everything he thought he knew. The demon fed on that uncertainty, growing more solid with each moment of doubt. And then Stern spoke, her voice cutting through the creature's whispers like a blade of clarity through fog. "He doesn't need your validation. His worth isn't measured by being perfect. It's measured by whether he learns from being wrong." The statement was so unexpected that even the demon hesitated. Stern continued, directing her words at Covenant while keeping the creature in her peripheral vision. "You were wrong about me. You wanted me dead because I didn't fit your understanding of how the warp works, how corruption spreads. And you know what? I don't blame you for that. I am dangerous. I am unpredictable. Your instincts weren't paranoid, they were cautious. You were just wrong about the nature of the threat. And being wrong doesn't make you a failure unless you refuse to adjust when new evidence appears." Covenant's bolt pistol wavered, not from weakness but from the cognitive dissonance of his primary target, defending him against a demon's psychological assault. "Why? Why defend me after everything?" Stern's answer was simple and devastating. "Because you're a good man trying to do right in an impossible situation. Because the real enemy isn't people who make mistakes. It's people who refuse to question whether their certainty might be wrong. Because I need you to see that I'm not what you thought I was. And you can't see that if you're too busy hating yourself for not predicting the unpredictable. The demon shrieked as its hold on Covenant's doubts weakened. It shifted tactics, turning its full attention to Sylvana. You already know she's right. You knew it when you freed her. You knew it when you called for coordination without authority. You know the system you serve is rotting from within. Why do you still pretend? Why do you cling to vows that serve masters who have abandoned the principles those vows were meant to uphold? Sylvana's response was prayer, the familiar words of devotion she had recited 10,000 times. But her voice shook, and the demon fed on that tremor of uncertainty. Stern moved then, not to attack the demon directly, but to place herself between it and Sylvana. She looked into her former sister's terrified eyes and spoke with the kind of authority that came from having walked through hell and chosen to remain human. Doubt is not betrayal. Questioning is not heresy. The Emperor created us with minds capable of judgment because he wanted us to use them. Faith without thought is just programming, and we're more than machines. Your vows were to protect humanity and serve the Emperor's vision. If the people giving you orders have betrayed that vision, then your loyalty to your vows means standing against them, not for them. The cathedral shook with an explosion from outside, a reminder that this philosophical battle was happening in the midst of a physical war. But the three of them remained frozen in their triangle around the demon, because they all understood instinctively that this moment mattered more than the combat raging beyond. This was the real battle, the one that would determine not just who lived or died today, but what the Imperium would become. The demon was everything wrong with absolute certainty taken to its extreme. The promise that if you just surrendered your judgment entirely, you would never have to face the agony of difficult choices. It offered the comfort of mindless rage, of perfect obedience, of letting someone or something else make all the decisions. And standing against it were three deeply flawed people who had all made terrible mistakes, but who were still trying to do better, still wrestling with conscience, still choosing humanity over easy answers. Covenant lowered his bolt pistol completely and spoke with the kind of honesty that went against every inquisitorial instinct. I don't know if you were right to kill the High Lords. I don't know if the corruption you claim to have found was real or imagined. But I know that I'm going to investigate it myself rather than just accepting the official story. And if you were right, if they were truly compromised, then maybe the Imperium owes you an apology instead of an execution. Sylvana's prayer shifted, the words changing from rote recitation to genuine supplication. Emperor, give me the wisdom to know when obedience serves you and when it betrays you. Give me the courage to think when thinking is hard and act when action is terrifying. Let me serve your vision of humanity united and strong, not just the commands of those who claim to speak for you. The prayer was heresy by official standards, a claim that the faithful should judge their leaders rather than simply obey. It was also the most genuine expression of devotion Stern had heard in years. The demon was weakening now, its form flickering as the doubts and fears it fed on transformed into something it couldn't digest. Resolve, purpose, uncertain but earnest. The three warriors raised their weapons as one, and this time when they fired, the rounds found purchase. The creature came apart, not with a scream, but with something like frustrated respect. You will regret this, all of you. The comfort of certainty is sweeter than the agony of conscience. But the words rang hollow because they all knew that wasn't true, that the agony of conscience was the price of remaining human, and humanity was worth any price. The battle for the cathedral raged for hours more, but the tide had turned. Coordinated forces pushed back the chaos incursion meter by meter, closing the warp rifts and eliminating the traitors who had managed to make planetfall. By the time Terra's primary sun rose on the next cycle, the attack had been repelled at enormous cost. Thousands dead, entire districts damaged, but the throne world itself still stood. And in the aftermath, as survivors picked through rubble and medics tended to the wounded, three people stood in the ruins of what had been a sacred space and tried to figure out what came next. Covenant spoke first, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had fought physical and spiritual battles simultaneously. I'm opening an official investigation into your allegations about the deceased High Lords. Full inquisitorial authority, access to all sealed records. If you were right, the Imperium needs to know. If you were wrong, the Imperium needs to know that too. But either way, the truth matters more than the narrative we've been telling ourselves. Stern nodded slowly, knowing this was more than she had hoped for, but less than what was needed. And if the investigation confirms what I found, what then? The Inquisitor's smile was bitter. Then we face the fact that we've been serving a system that's been eating itself from within, and we figure out how to fix it without destroying what's worth saving. Not going to lie, Stern, that terrifies me more than any demon. But after today, after fighting beside you, I'm more terrified of pretending everything is fine when it clearly isn't. He paused, then added with painful honesty, "You were right about one thing. I did want you dead because you proved me wrong. And that's exactly the kind of pride that lets corruption flourish. So consider this my attempt to be better than my worst instincts." Sylvana had been silent, staring at the bloodstains on the cathedral floor where sisters and traitors had fallen together. When she finally spoke, her words came slow and measured. "The canoness will demand your execution still. The official position hasn't changed. But I'm going to tell her what happened here, how you fought beside us, how you helped coordinate a defense that saved thousands of lives. I'm going to recommend leniency, maybe even pardoning. She'd probably reject it. Might execute me for suggesting it. But I saw what obedience without judgment leads to today, and I won't be that person anymore." The three of them stood together in the ruins, unlikely allies bound by crisis, and a shared realization that the systems they served were not the same as the principles they had sworn to uphold. Outside, the Imperium continued, vast and terrible and magnificent and broken. Nothing was resolved. The investigation would take years. The debates about Stern's actions would rage across 1,000 worlds. The corruption she had exposed would fight desperately to remain hidden. But something had shifted in this moment, something small but vital. Three people who represented different faces of imperial authority had chosen conscience over convenience, truth over narrative, humanity over doctrine. Stern looked at her hands, still stained with the blood of high lords and demons alike. "I don't regret what I did, but I regret that it was necessary. I regret that the system is so broken that the only way to get anyone to pay attention to corruption at the highest levels was to commit what looks like the ultimate heresy. I wish I could have worked within the system. I wish the system was something that could be worked within. But wishing doesn't change reality, and I'd rather die trying to fix what's broken than live pretending everything is fine." Covenant holstered his weapon and extended a hand to Stern in a gesture that would have been unthinkable hours ago. "You're still under investigation. You're still technically a heretic until my inquiry is complete. But you fought well today, and you saved lives including mine. That buys you time. Use it wisely." The handshake was brief but significant, a recognition that enemies could become allies when the real threat revealed itself, that labels like heretic and loyal were sometimes less important than the choices people made when everything was on the line. Forces were arriving from across Terra now that the immediate crisis had passed. Custodian Guard, Grey Knights, senior Inquisitors who would want answers about what had happened here. The moment of understanding between Stern, Covenant, and Sylvana was ending. Reality reasserting itself with all its complexity and consequence. They would be questioned, their actions scrutinized. The fact that they had fought together would be seen by some as proof of conspiracy, by others as pragmatic necessity. Nothing was certain except that the path forward would be difficult for all of them. Sylvana gripped Stern's shoulder, the gesture of one warrior to another. "If this investigation proves you right, everything changes. The Imperium will have to confront truths it spent millennia avoiding. There will be purges, restructuring, maybe civil war. Are you ready for that?" Are any of us ready for what comes if the foundations are revealed to be rotten? Stern's answer was quiet, but unwavering. The foundations were already rotten. All I did was stop pretending they weren't. Whatever comes next, it can't be worse than the slow decay of serving a system that's forgotten what it was created to protect. The first of the custodians arrived, their golden armor untarnished despite hours of battle elsewhere in the palace district. They assessed the scene with eyes that had watched over the Emperor himself, eyes that missed nothing and judged everything. Their captain approached, his voice resonating with absolute authority. Lord Inquisitor Covenant, Sister Sylvana, and Ephrael Stern, declared traitor to the Imperium. You will all accompany us for debriefing. Any resistance will be met with terminal force. The words were not a threat, but a statement of inevitable fact. The three of them exchanged glances, a moment of solidarity before the machinery of Imperial justice ground forward. They had changed something today, planted seeds of doubt and conscience that might grow into reform, or might be crushed before they could take root. The outcome was uncertain. But as they were led away under the watchful eyes of humanity's greatest protectors, Stern felt something she hadn't experienced since Parnis. Not peace, exactly, but purpose clarified. She had torn down corrupt authority. Now came the harder part, building something better from the ruins. The debriefing chambers beneath the Imperial Palace were places where truth was extracted with the same precision surgeons used to remove tumors. Stern, Covenant, and Sylvana were separated immediately, each taken to their own cell of sterile white walls and observation lenses that watched from every angle. They would be questioned for days, their stories cross-referenced and analyzed, every inconsistency examined for evidence of conspiracy or corruption. The Imperium did not take attacks on Terra lightly, and the fact that the attack had coincided with the hunting of a declared traitor raised questions that demanded answers. Stern sat alone in her cell and waited. She had expected this, planned for it even. The isolation didn't bother her anymore. She had learned in the depths of Parnis that solitude was just another state of being, neither punishment nor privilege. What occupied her thoughts was not fear of execution, but curiosity about what the investigation would uncover. Covenant had promised to examine the evidence she had gathered about the High Lords. Would he find what she had found? Would he see the pattern of corruption she had pieced together, or would he conclude she had been paranoid, broken by warp exposure, seeing conspiracy where there was only bureaucratic incompetence? The answer came 3 weeks later when Covenant himself entered her cell. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his eyes carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your worldview systematically dismantled. He sat across from her in silence for a long moment before speaking. You were right. About all of it, the evidence you gathered was genuine. The High Lords you killed had made pacts with entities in the warp, traded favors with chaos cults, allowed entire sectors to fall because it benefited their political positions. His voice cracked slightly. I've been an Inquisitor for 40 years. I've hunted heretics across 100 worlds, and I never looked up. Never questioned whether the people giving orders might be the ones who needed investigating. Stern felt no satisfaction in being vindicated, only a deep weariness. So what happens now? Covenant's laugh was hollow. Now comes the hard part. The new High Lords are demanding your immediate execution as a demonstration that no one is above Imperial law. Half the Inquisition agrees with them. The other half thinks you're a hero who should be pardoned and possibly elevated to inquisitorial rank yourself. The Sororitas are split down the middle, with some calling for your canonization as a living saint, and others insisting you're the worst kind of heretic. And the custodians, who theoretically serve no master but the Emperor himself, are watching all of us to see what we do next. The Inquisitor leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Here's what I think. I think you committed murder. I think you violated every law we have about proper investigation and due process. I think you could have brought your evidence to people who might have acted on it, and you chose violence instead. And I think all of that is true, and I also think you were right to do it, because the system was so compromised that working within it would have meant your evidence disappearing and you being disappeared shortly after. So where does that leave us? Stern met his gaze steadily. It leaves us with the question the Imperium has been avoiding for 10,000 years. What do you do when following the rules means allowing evil to continue? When the proper channels are controlled by the people who need to be stopped? When loyalty to the system means betrayal of the principles the system was built to uphold? She paused, then added quietly, "There is no good answer, Covenant. Only choices and consequences. I made mine. Now the Imperium has to make its own." The door opened again and Sylvana entered, her armor bearing new scars from battles Stern hadn't witnessed. The sister looked different somehow, her posture less rigid, her eyes more open. "The canoness has agreed to a compromise," she announced. "Stern, you will not be pardoned. The crimes you committed cannot be officially forgiven without undermining the entire structure of Imperial law, but you will not be executed either. Instead, you're being declared a penitent crusader. You will be sent on missions of extreme danger, suicide assignments essentially, fighting the Imperium's worst enemies until you either die or accumulate enough service to be considered redeemed." It was a political solution that satisfied no one and therefore allowed everyone to claim partial victory. The hardliners could say justice was served by making her life a constant penance. The reformers could say her skills were being used to protect humanity rather than wasted in execution. And Stern herself understood that it was probably the best outcome she could have hoped for. "I accept," she said simply. Sylvana's expression softened slightly. "There's more. I've volunteered to accompany you, to serve as your watchdog and also as your shield sister." The canoness approved it, probably hoping I'll kill you the first time you step out of line. "But I think we both know that's not why I'm really doing this." Stern understood without needing explanation. Sylvana had been changed by everything that happened, had felt the foundations of her certainty crack open, and now she needed to find a new way of serving the Emperor that didn't require blindness to uncomfortable truths. Walking the line between faith and thought, between obedience and conscience, was terrifying. But doing it together was slightly less so. "Thank you," Stern said quietly, "for choosing the hard path, for not taking the easy comfort of certainty." Sylvana's response was barely audible. "Thank you for making it impossible to go back to not seeing." The months that followed became years. Stern and Sylvana fought on the edges of Imperial space, in war zones where victory was measured in survival rather than triumph. They hunted chaos cultists in the depths of hive worlds. They defended shrine worlds from Xenos invasions. They walked into situations that should have killed them and somehow walked back out, changed but alive. And everywhere they went, they carried with them the quiet revolution of conscience. They questioned orders when orders seemed wrong. They prioritized civilian lives over tactical advantage. They showed mercy when mercy served justice better than execution. And slowly, imperceptibly, they became something new. Not quite Sureritas by the old definition, not quite Inquisition, but something the Imperium desperately needed even if it didn't know how to classify it. Word of their actions spread through the same networks that had sheltered Stern in Terra's underhive. Stories of the heretic who had been right and the sister who had chosen wisdom over obedience. The tales were embellished and distorted as all stories are, but the core truth remained. That individuals could make a difference. That standing against corruption was possible even when the corruption was absolute. That the Imperium's survival didn't depend on blind obedience, but on the courage of people willing to think, to question, to choose righteousness, even when righteousness was inconvenient. Covenant's investigation continued, meticulously documenting the extent of corruption in the upper levels of Imperial governance. His reports were classified, buried under layers of secrecy, accessible only to the highest authorities. But the fact that they existed at all was significant. Seeds planted in darkness that might someday break through to light. He reformed his own practices, training new Inquisitors to question their assumptions, to look for truth rather than confirmation of what they already believed. It was slow work, generational work, the kind that might not bear fruit for centuries. But it was necessary work, and someone had to do it. Years became decades. Stern's hair turned silver at the temples. Sylvanas' face gained the lines that came from smiling more often than frowning. They were still technically on their penitent crusade, still officially atoning for crimes that many believed warranted execution. But they had also saved countless lives, stopped incursions that would have cost entire sectors, and demonstrated that the Imperium's strength came not from rigid hierarchy, but from individuals willing to act with both courage and conscience. They had become, without meaning to, examples of what faith looked like when it was tempered with wisdom. On a quiet evening on a world whose name didn't matter, Stern and Sylvana sat on the ruins of a bunker they had defended against impossible odds. The battle was over. The enemy defeated, the survivors being evacuated to safety. In the distance, transport ships rose into the twilight sky, carrying people who would live because two warriors had refused to follow doctrine that would have sacrificed them. Sylvana broke the comfortable silence with a question that had been building for years. Do you think we changed anything? Really changed it, I mean, not just delayed the inevitable collapse? Stern considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I don't know. The Imperium is vast and ancient and resistant to change. The forces that benefit from corruption are entrenched and powerful. We removed some bad actors, but the system that created them is still intact. But I look at the people we've saved, the soldiers we've trained to think instead of just obey, the officials who saw what we did and found their own courage to stand against wrongdoing. And I think maybe change doesn't happen all at once. Maybe it happens one person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of conscience at a time. Maybe we're not meant to save the whole Imperium. Maybe we're just meant to save the people in front of us, and trust that enough people doing the same will eventually add up to something better. Sylvana nodded slowly, then smiled with an expression that was equal parts sadness and hope. The old me would have called that heresy, would have insisted that only total obedience to the divine plan could save humanity. But the divine plan requires human hands to implement it, and humans make mistakes. The Emperor gave us minds for a reason. Faith means trusting those minds to seek truth, even when truth is uncomfortable. She paused, watching the last transport disappear into the stars. I think we're doing what the Emperor would have wanted. Not what his broken Imperium demands, but what he actually envisioned when he tried to unite humanity. People thinking, choosing, striving to be better than they were. The two women sat in silence as darkness fell completely and the stars emerged in their ancient patterns. Above them, the galaxy turned in its endless dance. 1,000,000 worlds where humans lived and died and struggled to find meaning in a universe that offered none. Some of those worlds would fall to chaos. Some would be consumed by Xenos. Some would simply fade into irrelevance, forgotten by an Imperium too vast to remember all its children. But some would survive. Some would thrive. And maybe, just maybe, enough of them would learn to question, to think, to choose conscience over convenience, that the Imperium might evolve into something worthy of the species it claimed to protect. Stern knew she would probably never see that transformation. She would die fighting, as all warriors eventually did, her name remembered by some as a saint and by others as the worst kind of traitor. History would argue about her for millennia, unable to decide whether she had saved the Imperium or wounded it beyond healing. But that uncertainty was itself a kind of victory. It meant the conversation was happening. It meant people were questioning. And questions, once asked, could never be completely unasked. The Emperor had once said that the difference between gods and men was that gods demanded worship while men demanded understanding. Stern had turned her guns on the High Lords, not because she thought she was a god, but because she was fundamentally human, flawed and uncertain, and trying her best to do right in circumstances where right had become impossible to define clearly. And maybe that was the real lesson, the truth that the Imperium had forgotten in its 10,000 years of rigid doctrine. That humanity's strength didn't come from perfect obedience to perfect authority. It came from imperfect people making imperfect choices and learning from their mistakes. It came from the courage to stand alone when standing together meant complicity in evil. It came from asking the hardest question anyone could ask. What if everything I've been taught is wrong? The stars offered no answers. They never had. But they bore silent witness to the fact that two warriors sat beneath them, alive and free and still choosing to fight for something better. And across the Imperium, in underhives and manufactorums and noble spires and military outposts, others were making similar choices, planting similar seeds. The harvest might take centuries, but it was coming. Change was coming. And it started with one person looking at the system they served and asking whether service to a broken structure was the same as service to the ideals that structure was meant to embody. Stern stood, extending a hand to help Sylvana to her feet. Their work was never finished. There would always be another battle, another crisis, another impossible choice. But they would face it together, armed with weapons and with something more dangerous. Questions, conscience, the refusal to accept that might made right or that authority was the same as righteousness. They were the Imperium's most faithful heretics, its most loyal traitors, its conscience wrapped in ceramite and righteousness armed with bolters. And they would keep fighting until the galaxy burned out or until humanity finally learned to be worthy of its own survival. If this story made you think about authority and conscience, about the difference between loyalty and obedience, about what we owe to systems that have lost their way, then share it. Let others wrestle with these questions. Like this video if you want to see more stories that challenge easy answers. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we need most. And remember that in your own life, whatever battles you face, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is question whether the fight you've been told to fight is the fight worth fighting. In the grim darkness of the far future, there may be only war, but how we wage that war and why still matters. It will always matter, and that choice belongs to you.